2050 is said to be the point of no return. The point where global temperatures will have risen too much. The point where localized climate systems will be doomed and will experience negative effects that will cause them to decline, and decline.
Nearly half of humanity is living in the danger zone now. Many ecosystems are at the point of no return now.
If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon.
Climate change is the crisis of our lifetime, is the defining issue of today's world.
That was some pretty heavy stuff, don't you think? It seems like we're not doing anything at all, and 2050 is rapidly approaching. But what if I told you there could be something done here in Toronto that could really help us stop feeling the effects of climate change? Something that would improve the health of all Torontonians and the city itself. Perhaps a grassroots level change, something that may have slipped under the radar. That's right, it's condos. Bet you weren't expecting that one. 55% of Toronto's total carbon emissions come from buildings. Like, of this whole entire city, one of the biggest problems seems to be our buildings. That includes our condos. That's problematic, don't you think? There once was a Toronto with barely any condos. That's hard to believe. Our skyline's littered with condos and high-rise buildings. But how did we get here? York University professor Ute Lehre gives some context.
In the 2000s, we saw a lot of parking lots around Toronto. Vast areas in the downtown core for parking of cars. Again, coming from this European perspective, I didn't understand why there is so much space, empty space. And at one point, the developers also started to see that, obviously, and started to invent a lifestyle that we now call condo living.
Indeed, condos have many problems, from their construction, maintenance, to how they're governed, and this is all hurting the environment. This is hurting Torontonians. And buildings, they last a long time. The ones standing now are going to be standing in 2050 and beyond. It is these buildings that will determine whether or not we'll reach that point of no return. We got used to these buildings, but their building codes and standards were not the standard we needed them to be. In their haste to add to the condo boom, poor construction materials and processes for powering these buildings were seen as cost and time saves. It gets super bad. Think about carbon dioxide and its impact on the environment, but buildings have something called embodied carbon. So the carbon dioxide released during the manufacturing, transportation, and construction of building materials for a building makes up 25% of the total life cycle carbon emissions. That's embodied carbon. Think about that for a minute. Well after the building has been built in stands and stands and stands, because of the way it's been built, it's releasing greenhouse gases and hurting the environment. So while there may have been some costs saved during the construction process, we're paying the biggest one right now. Our buildings are producing too many carbon emissions. An example of poor construction materials is something common in all of these shots. Lots of windows and lots of glass. Not only was there glass literally falling from the sky and posing a literal threat to hurting Torontonians at one point, but there's other real effects too.
The massive use of glass as a wall, an outside wall, in a climate where you see extreme heights and temperature, both on the height and the low side, higher and low side, of course, is problematic. The sunlight coming in the summer through the windows increases the need for air conditioning. The cold weather, the cold winds in the winter, just the opposite, needs heating. So they're highly, not very environmentally friendly buildings. So that's a lot of energy that is just wasted, thrown out the window, blown out the window.
Sure, what she's saying is right. In the summer, when the light comes through the windows, it gets super, super hot. So of course I want to crank up my AC. And then in the winter, when it's super, super cold, of course I'm going to crank up my heating system. And so that's why our buildings are consuming so much energy.
It doesn't help that a lot of condos have a combustion-based heating and hot water system, aka they burn things like natural gas, oil, propane in order to generate heat. These are fossil fuels. Professor Mark Winfield from the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University even says that
in Toronto, I don't know, we must be 80 to 90% natural gas for space heating.
The bottom line, condos bad because they keep burning fossil fuels. But let's do a quick refresher as to why burning fossil fuels are so bad in the first place.
climate change is an overarching issue. It refers to long-term changes in temperatures and weather patterns. If climate change is a tree, then global warming is a large branch on this tree. It's the rise in global temperatures because of the increase in greenhouse gas emissions, which trap heat in our atmosphere. So when there's too much of these greenhouse gases, our Earth gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and that causes all sorts of problems, propelling climate change. So the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, gas, for all sorts of reasons, contribute to 90% of all carbon dioxide emissions, which is one of the main problematic greenhouse gases that is trapping way too much heat in our atmosphere.
Some of it goes back to original construction and questions about, was energy efficiency optimized in the original design and construction of the building? Which at the moment, for the most part in Toronto, the answer is basically no. So these things were not necessarily baked into the original design and construction of the buildings. Particularly, heavy use of glass walls and things like that, without necessarily particularly great insulation or sealing. Opportunity to have done heat pumps and other things are generally not taken. So there's sort of a challenge that's sort of baked into the buildings themselves.
If buildings right now are killers, then they must be transformed in some way that they facilitate a healthier and greener Toronto, that they make sure that the point of no return is never, ever reached. And how they can do that is by being retrofitted, becoming low carbon and releasing net zero emissions. Former Toronto City Councillor and current Chief Sustainability Officer at York University, Mike Layton, has a lot of experience helping condos from continuing to be killers. Retrofitting takes many forms.
Ordinary retrofit would typically refer to things like upgrading your appliances to Energy Star, sealing your windows. Like these are pretty easy things to do. I guess swapping out your gas boiler for a heat pump, like that kind of thing is probably what you'd consider in a traditional retrofit. Updating your light fixtures, for example, like that can have a huge impact. Just changing your bulbs can have an enormous impact on the amount of electricity you consume. Deep retrofits are when you start really looking at some of the technologies that it would take to get to net zero.
And we must push for deep retrofits because the change they offer is stunning and unparalleled. They reduce greenhouse gas emissions by almost 80% and cut down the building's total energy usage by almost 50%, half. But this isn't enough. There are other retrofits that can have a huge impact on saving energy and saving the environment. There are green roofs or walls where plants provide insulation for condos while purifying the surrounding air. Heat pumps with their reversing valves that can pump out heat or bring it in, acting as heaters and air conditioners. There's re-insulating the walls, trapping heat in the winter and repelling it in the summer, causing less energy to be used. There's also installing electric vehicle chargers for those electric vehicles. All of these things inhibit carbon dioxide from being emitted. But with all these options, it's hard to understand why more isn't being done. Keith Burrows from the Atmospheric Fund discusses how much organizations like that one are trying to push for retrofits.
These projects typically are done in one of two ways. One is in what we call like a deep retrofit, which is tackling multiple building systems at the same time. That's the ideal way to do these projects because there are synergies from doing multiple systems together in terms of sequencing and cost and right-sizing equipment. But that can be very expensive. When you're doing a big project, the upfront cost can be very high, and that's a challenge. The other approach is more of a what we call stepwise approach, which is creating a plan for the building to get it to net zero, near zero, and then taking steps along that kind of plan. So following a path in a stepwise fashion. This is something that we've seen condos take both approaches. They both can work.
Professor Laura Taylor from York University, who specializes in urban planning and environmental politics, says that retrofitting improves
the way that energy comes into and then is used in the buildings, right? And then how tight or airtight the buildings are so that you're not losing heat, and then the extent to which the exterior is made so that you can kind of regulate the amount of sunshine that you get.
Retrofits are really going to be our saviors because remember, these buildings aren't going anywhere. If we can lower their carbon usage, we're creating greener and easier lives for ourselves in the future. This doesn't just mean that we're saving the earth and whoop-de-doo. There are real ways Torontonians benefit from retrofitting.
Not only do we want to reduce energy and emissions, but we're also ideally improving the indoor environment for residents at the same time. So making the building and their homes more comfortable, improving air quality as well. And we're making the buildings more resilient.
In terms of, from the perspective of individuals, it means that energy costs go down. You're using less electricity, you're using less natural gas to heat or cool your home of the housing space.
Health improvements are right. Retrofitted buildings offer better air quality, better ventilation, and less carbon dioxide in the air breathed. On average, we're spending 90% of our time indoors, so investing in air quality is crucial.
Adam McGrath, the CTO of Evolute Inc., a company that helps to install EV chargers where there's limited energy to do that, says that this means that their main clientele is condo board members. By retrofitting for an electric vehicle charger, even if a resident doesn't have one, there's still only benefits.
Not to mention the resale values of you have an EV ready spot. Most people, I think, now realize that the market is shifting towards EV. The resale value, the property value of having EV available in your parking spot is a huge, huge attraction for new buyers.
Not only that, but retrofitted condos will be in demand.
People who are looking to buy condos, I think that's going to be something they're going to want to see. They're going to know that the condo that they're owning is low carbon or zero carbon. I think that's going to be important.
If there are benefits upon benefits, then why isn't every condo rushing to improve their buildings? Why aren't they trying to lower the amount of carbon dioxide they emit to net zero?
No, I mean, that's a complicated set of questions.
There are challenges, decarbonizing all multi-residential buildings.
To understand why it's so complicated, a step back needs to be taken to understand policy.
In a sense, the climate crisis is a product of choices of policy decisions in the past. In Canada in particular, because we've focused very strongly on the development of fossil fuel resources, particularly the oil sands, for example. And then we also need to be then thinking about what sorts of choices would enable different pathways forward. Ones which are much lower carbon and much better in sustainability terms. That's what policy is, an expression of a normative state that either we want to maintain or we want to achieve.
If we want a state where low carbon buildings, retrofitted buildings, are the norm, we must look at and question the policies we have. Mediator, arbitrator, and lawyer Sarah Jacobs, who focuses on resolving disputes that are land and property related, comments on provincial policy.
So we see in the policies an acknowledgement that climate change is happening and an encouragement for municipalities to plan for the impacts of a changing climate. So we've got kind of that general policy direction, and then municipalities might get into more of the nuts and bolts of how do we do that. When reviewing individual applications, certainly there have been changes in the building code to make construction more efficient, to make buildings more efficient, more green.
The building code, as mentioned, sets the minimum standards of acceptable construction. But we've already seen some weaknesses in this law when we talked about the materials used for the construction and the way that condos are powered. So it's clear, from a province standpoint, we are not at the normative stage where retrofitting buildings are or should be the norm. This is concerning. 2050 is rapidly approaching. However, municipalities like Toronto have the power to enforce more retrofits, or at least to strongly encourage them. Is the City of Toronto doing this? It's why I asked Duncan McClellan, a project manager on the existing buildings team, about what the city is doing.
Transform TO is our umbrella policy for the City of Toronto, where we're trying to get to low carbon or zero carbon. It started off by 2050 was our goal, and that aligned with a lot of the science-based goals that were being taken on worldwide. City Council has since decided that they would like to accelerate that and get it to 2040. So now with our goal being net zero as a whole by 2040, not just city buildings, everything in the City of Toronto, that's a pretty big undertaking. So to get us there, we need a combination of carrots and sticks. So we need a combination of incentives along with the bylaws and other policies to back that up. So in terms of incentives, buildings in the city need support, they need funding mechanisms, they need pathways to how to get these buildings to net zero. And then from the stick angle, there needs to be the policies that back that up. So Some of the policies that we are enacting is we just enacted a bylaw based around mandatory reporting for your energy and water. That just came in December, and that reporting starts this July. And then it moves all the way to the other end of the spectrum where there's mandatory building performance standards where we're gonna cap building archetypes at certain amounts of GHG, greenhouse gas emissions per square foot, and then ramp that down over time.
It's curious why the city changed their goal from 2050, setting it even earlier.
The decision was made that if we were to hit it by 2050, we wouldn't be hitting some of the targets that were set out globally. And city wanted to be seen as a leader, wanted to make sure that we hit some of those targets. It also takes a look at other different jurisdictions. We've done jurisdictional scans of different municipalities. New York has a model like that right now. I believe it's called Local Law 97, where they have building archetype caps, and then they penalize on top of that. And financial penalties started coming in this year. And Vancouver is also set to do that as well. So we're not doing this in a vacuum. We're not the only ones who have seen the data that this can be done and that these are the policy mechanisms that need to go for this. But we are one of the earlier ones to adopt some of this.
But despite the city wanting to be seen as a leader, despite the city wanting and starting to do these wonderful initiatives, it's already 2024. The city has even accelerated their goals before 2050. Can it be done? Will there be actual provincial policy or other sorts of policy that will help Toronto reach Transform TO's goal for net zero buildings? Will condos reach net zero?
The focus on condos is perplexing, but come here. It's importantly complicated because it's not just something like, I own this land and this land's all mine and I can do whatever I want with this land. It's a form of shared ownership.
A condo means that owners only own the unit they're living in, not the land it's on. There's shared ownership with all other condo owners of the building and other assets like lobbies, hallways, elevators, recreational facilities, walkways, gardens, structural elements, and mechanical and electrical services, and you get the idea. York University professor Ranu Basu, who specializes in urban and social justice, categorizes condos because of this characteristic.
There's a very interesting book, I don't know if you've read it, but it's called Privatopia. And it was not so much on condominium development as more on the creation, the multitude of communities, private communities that have evolved in lots of parts of the world, but this is from the US, and a lot of them have sort of these gated communities where they have their own sort of kind of welfare services, whether it's access to public parks or playgrounds or swimming pools or tennis courts or others, but they fund it themselves, and anybody outside that as part of the city is not. So the tax base gets lower and lower, and so it's only concentrated within. So condominiums are like that too, right? I mean, depends on, they have their own communities and their own sort of status and sort of thing. So that can be sort of their minor vertical privatopias in a way, right? So.
And these privatopias also mean condo owners not only pay for their share of the property, but also pay condominium fees to the condo corporation or board of directors. But let's just call them the condo board. This money covers all sorts of things, like the maintenance and replacement of things falling under shared ownership, plus the condo's insurance, utilities, and also the reserve fund to cover future maintenance and repairs. This is key to keep in mind. These fees sometimes get super high and are adjusted according to the budget made by the condo board, also something to keep in mind. Ideally, all residents of condos have a say in shared matters of the condo, but this isn't always the case. Some financial and management decisions are just up to the condo board, and this is because of the bylaws they've enshrined.
The other piece is that condos are particularly tough because they're made up of so many different individuals, and each condo building is its own corporation. So to reach all of these condo buildings and to make decisions, they have to be made on the building by building level. Whereas if you have a large portfolio of buildings, say a large apartment ownership group or a large commercial real estate company that owns many, many buildings, they can make something that goes across their entire portfolio. And having one person make a decision can influence 100 buildings, 200 buildings. But in the condo world, you not only have to have that conversation with each building, each of the 100 or 200 buildings, you also have to convince a condo board or talk to a condo board that it's not to say that they're making wrong decisions. It's just, it's hard to connect with every single one of the condo buildings in Toronto at a level where then everybody understands what we're trying to do.
Talking to each condo board may be tricky, like Duncan said, but it can also be an area of opportunity.
When you look at single-family homes, we're talking hundreds of thousands of homes that need to be upgraded, all with very similar equipment, and it's not very challenging, but getting hundreds of thousands of homes to do it is tricky. Getting hundreds of condominiums to do it is probably a better opportunity, because you only have to do 100 projects, and you can probably get the same results as doing a couple 100,000 projects in individual single-family homes.
Whether seen as an inhibition or a marker of opportunity, one thing is clear. Condos are complicated because of the way they function.
You have to realize that any new technology or any new solution that you propose to them has to be attractive. You have to be putting something that's going to add value to that condo, to that person making the decision, who's also generally going to be an owner.
Condo boards also have their own bylaws and rules that talk about what a unit owner can and cannot do with their unit and the types of renovations that they can undertake. Generally speaking, condo unit owners, they're not supposed to interfere with the quiet enjoyment of other owners. So they're not supposed to become a nuisance with the work that they're doing to their unit, but also, they don't want to, from the condo board's perspective, they don't want them causing damage to the condo building as well. So they would need permission from the condo board for any of the renovations. And if they don't have it and they start their retrofitting project without that permission, they could be potentially facing a court injunction telling them to stop the work. And there's also the Condominium Authority Tribunal that can deal with disputes that relate to the nuisance of the work. But this tribunal doesn't actually have jurisdiction to deal with the matter if it's about the work causing damage to the condo building. And interestingly, it also doesn't deal with charging for electric vehicles, which may be where a lot of disputes come up as well for people who are looking for more sustainability.
If there is a dispute between the condo board and residents, the efforts to resolve them can be time-consuming and stressful, and may stop residents from pursuing retrofits to avoid this. So if a person wants to take on a deep retrofit, and it occurs outside their unit, like installing an electric vehicle charger in the shared parking space, it's going to be shut down most of the time. The condo board has the authority to do this. But there are other retrofitting instances where the condo board is pushing for a retrofit and needs residents' approval, but they don't obtain it. Why?
Who has the final say in retrofitting decisions, or any decisions for that matter? Is it wholly the condo board? Do residents have a bigger stake? There's a seesaw of power, and Professor Laura Taylor talks more about the underlying ideology that governs these sorts of decisions that are made.
Captures the idea that you're not just in a material landscape, a place with soil and bedrock and trees, but the way that you look at that place affects the way that you use it, or affects the way that, frankly, that you govern it. So, we could have a panel of 5 folks here, or 10 folks, depending on what they are, and have a real estate agent, a mother, somebody who's interested in wildlife, for example, and everybody would look at the same piece of land and see different values from it. So it's a material landscape, and it's the ideology that people bring to it, and how much that fits with their values and the way that they think the world should be, or the way that they think that that piece of land should be in their world.
These values placed on the piece of land, the condo itself, are a social barrier to retrofitting. A lot of the time it can be this idea that if things have been functioning just fine a certain way, why go about changing it?
People are resistant to anything that's new, always. People want to continue, in general, people want to continue doing what they're doing. Inertia is a powerful force.
For condominium buildings, they have one condominium building, and a condominium board has a lot of things that they're worried about. And are they going to see that climate action is the biggest problem that they have? Probably not.
In many Ontario condos, the final decision is up to the condo board, especially when it comes to allocating money for projects like installing electrical vehicle chargers, like doing retrofitting projects. So what happens if the board is comprised of people who don't see any use for these types of retrofits? Spoiler, nothing will happen. The thing is, we simply can't afford this type of inertia.
The authority that the condo board derives is right from the Condominium Act. So it's built into the provincial legislation that creates the condo board, where they can create bylaws to say how all of this is going to go. But ultimately the decision to change those bylaws and rules is up to the condo board. So it depends how many like-minded people there are in a condo building with respect to sustainability and retrofitting units.
There is this seesaw of power and decision-making, which complicates everything and is a real barrier to seeing retrofits from getting done, from reaching net zero, from preventing that point of return being reached. We must always keep power dynamics in mind.
Power is exceptionally important. You cannot understand the city or the right to the city, as we talk about, or planning in cities without understanding power. You cannot. I mean, everything is about power. How do we define power? Power, of course, in terms of structural definitions. We live in a sort of a capitalist society, a patriarchal society, and a race. We have to take into consider racism in society. So all of these intersections are exceptionally important to think about when we're thinking about power. But there's also the question of agency, where communities are not just, they're not just latent, or they're just not quiet, but they often resist.
The condo board shouldn't be villainized, though. They're forces of change, capable of understanding the current climate crisis. They're integral to ensuring that we reach net zero. And Manny from Evolute Direct speaks on this.
We specialize in the condo and apartment building market, so the multi-residential market, helping those buildings implement EV charging in an efficient way.
Manny works really closely with condo corporations and shows that it isn't made of people where retrofitting goes to die. And the fact that Manny and Keith both move beyond the condo corporation's powers in dictating decisions when it comes to retrofitting, including tenants, including condo owners, shows this muddy power dynamic that's going on.
I think every condo today, if they spend a couple of minutes researching this or speaking to their owners, I think they'll see that EV charging is very important. As condo owners and tenants start asking for EV, that's where we see condos willing to implement this.
Condos that we've worked with have been fantastic. We've been very fortunate and have had champions on the board who are advocating for decarbonizing their buildings. What we have seen is some challenges with condo boards trying to convince the condo owners to invest in decarbonization projects. And I think that that problem kind of arises sometimes when the board isn't necessarily taking a pragmatic approach. Like when a board is pushing for a retrofit in the building, had to be pragmatic and think about what is possible within the community.
The Condo Act is a guide for condos on how they must function, and upholding the laws in this act is one of the jobs of the Condo Board. In this law, for major deep retrofits, they fall under a section where it must be approved by all condo residents in the form of a vote. All condo residents, therefore, play a pivotal role for pushing for retrofits and for achieving a net zero Toronto, where the point of return is never reached.
But also not being naive and not and keeping in mind that we live in a very much in a capitalist, profit, neoliberal society. We cannot forget that. So what are the motivations? Always think about the motivations.
To convince relevant stakeholders, pragmatism is required. Why do people not care about retrofits, and how can we make them care? One major thing that turns almost every condo owner off from retrofits is
there's a financial barrier, right? Which is kind of first and foremost. Deep retrofit projects are expensive, and they typically, there's not a great business case for projects where you're doing fuel switching, where you're converting from gas to electricity. So, and in addition to that, there aren't great programs for condos to tap into to get public funding to help support those projects. There are great programs in other sectors, but not in for condos.
Cost. So there is an upfront cost.
Retrofits are expensive, and
everyone doesn't want to put the money down for these types of things.
It's expensive.
In the long term, you may save enough money to pay for the investment, but that doesn't solve the problem that in the very short term, you need a pile of money to make the retrofits to your building. And if you don't have access to that, you can't do anything.
Deep retrofits, or even other types of retrofits, are costly. The expenses for the technology itself and knowing who to reach out to install or facilitate the installation are huge. Condos likely have to dip into their reserve funds, budgets they've made and they don't want to budge on. A lot of condos just don't have the money, despite government and nonprofit aid that the city and the Atmospheric Fund provide. So how on earth can we possibly reach net zero? The point of no return seems closer than ever when we see that we're in a profit-driven society. Beyond paper that we've given monetary value, social and organizational barriers with regards to how condos are run, condos face technical barriers too.
Technical barriers for retrofitting into existing condos are going to be mostly your physical capacity. How much physical space do you have to put new equipment in? Physical barriers, whether that's concrete slab, whether that's pipes on the walls, pipes on the ceilings. And then the other thing is going to be your electrical capacity. How much electrical service do they bring to that building or that location in the first place to feed the demand and loads that were designed into that project versus what the reality is now of how much is actually being used and how much we want to add to that by putting EV systems in place to charge electric vehicles.
So there's this physical limit to what a building, a condo, can handle, how much more infrastructure it can support, especially when it comes to electrical vehicle chargers. This also applies to other type of retrofits. The barriers to access, and especially accessing the labor required to execute retrofits, is a big deal. Right now and in the future, Canada is expecting a shortage of trade workers, from HVAC experts, plasterers and drywall installers, mechanical engineers, technicians, you name it. The expertise to execute retrofits must be taught and needs to be expanded.
Capacity. The condo board may not have the capacity to take on a really complex project like a deep retrofit, and the industry also is limited in capacity, which means you end up with you could have very expensive projects because of that, and extended timelines. So there are capacity issues kind of on both sides of the fence there.
If each building is its own story and needs its own special retrofit, and we don't have the expertise to match this level of work required, this is but a guarantee that we will reach that point of no return.
Optimizing from an energy efficiency perspective will slow you down, because it does mean that all kinds of dimensions of the construction have to be done well. And that costs money, because then you have to pay people who have much greater skills and give them more time to do the job and all kinds of things to do it right.
And these projects, the timelines on these projects are really long. When we're talking about deep retrofits, those projects can be 3, 4 years, 5 years, depending on how long it takes to get the project off the ground. So when you think about that and how many multi-residential buildings we have, how long each of those projects take, and how little time we have left to meet our climate goals, I think it's really important that we act as quickly as we can now.
It's a race against the clock. There's one barrier that if we can overcome can help solve everything else mentioned. We need to focus on policy.
Frankly, the City of Toronto has done an amazing job with their studies and policies. This is actual City of Toronto, policies about retrofitting and thinking about what to do. And they're using one of the biggest levers that they have, which is to connect people with grants. So if you're a property management company, or if you're a building owner, and we're talking about the large apartment style condominium buildings, it is to essentially give people funding to help them pay for those retrofits. And I think that that's kind of the only way you can do it.
I think there's always a possibility of a disconnect between policies that tell us this is a great idea, we should do this, we should be planning for the impacts of a changing climate, and whether that will actually happen on the ground. So this is because we're talking about what private property owners want to do and actually can do with their property. Initiatives could actually work the way the building is constructed. For example, if people want to have solar panels added to their windows, you actually have to know if the type of window that's installed there can support that. And, there'd be an interest from everybody who lives there in having like a consistent look for the building as well. So that's something that, the board can assist with and maybe have a process in place for people to be able to implement those kinds of changes, rather than having a haphazard unit by unit approach that really shows us this disconnect between policies that tell us it's a great idea and what can realistically happen.
Transform TO has not been the highest priority for City Council.
Let's face it, we all disagree on these things, and that's okay. Some of us think that the efforts we're doing right now is enough, and others don't. Some of us think that the policy we have right now is enough, and others don't. But the thing is, if we keep sitting around and talking about it, we're never going to reach our goals for 2050 or even earlier like the city's planned. We'll probably reach the point of no return. Now is the time to start taking action. And that's why I sat with Nish and Golnar, who live in condos, to really see what's happening on the ground level for condos. Are they really retrofitting? What's going on over there?
My name is Golnar Davudi, and I've been living in a condo since 2021. Learning about how we've been contributing to making more greenhouse gases and what has been happening with the planet, with the climate change, I think it is a major issue, and it is important to get educated and learn how we can help.
I'm Nish. I'm a software engineering student. I've never heard of carbon retrofitting.
Do you know anything about like a condo board or if there's anything like that?
I'm only aware of the members that are usually representing the residents, that we can, stay connected to them, ask questions if we have any, but more than that, no, I'm not aware of.
How are energy consumption and conservation monitored and managed within the building?
Right, that's a very good question actually, because there's no real concern about it. Most people are concerned with getting the things we consume, not about how to manage the consumption.
How is indoor air quality monitored and maintained in the building?
So we have indoor air monitoring systems. They do have very strong sensors that are very sensitive to specific pollutants. So we use them to check up the quality of the air. So if there's any unusual amount of pollutants, the management system let us know about that.
In your condo, what measures has the condo implemented to improve energy efficiency, like LED lightings, energy efficient appliances?
Nothing of the sorts that I'm aware of. The lights outside, well, they are sensor activated, so that helps save energy, I'm sure. But outside of that, I don't really think anybody really cares about energy considerations.
These are just two different condos with two different boards and two different perspectives, and are no way representative of all the condos in Ontario. Nish and Golnar really underscore how tough it is to reach out to all condos in Toronto and get them to reach net zero. So what's the key?
Every project we work on, and this applies to condos, this applies to social housing, apartments, you name it. You have to have champions within the building or the building ownership that want these projects to happen. Otherwise, they're not happening. You really need the people and that drive.
The key is us, the people. It sounds cheesy, but it is true.
A project in downtown Toronto, the French Quarter shared facilities condominiums, two 11-story buildings next to each other. And the condo board decided that instead of replacing their chiller, their cooling system with a typical chiller, they were going to replace that with a heat pump instead. And that heat pump was not only going to provide cooling for the building, but also was going to offset most of their gas consumption for space heating. So significantly reduced fossil fuel combustion and emissions. And the board was just relentless in terms of making sure that this project happened. Without their kind of leadership and really championing this idea and spending countless hours trying to make it a reality, it just wouldn't have happened. This is the first installation of this particular type of heat pump in Canada, first commercial installation. They really were ambitious. What we're seeing this winter is offsetting about 70% of the gas consumption in the building, and residents don't even know that it happened. Basically, they're just as comfortable as they were before because there was no work that happened in the suite. It was really all the work was done in the mechanical rooms and on the roof.
Having people in power and electing politicians who are concerned with retrofitting is major and goes back to policy. As Mike Layton shows us what a great and environmentally conscious politician can do, and how working with the community can actually yield incredible results.
Well, we worked really closely with residents associations in the neighborhood to make sure that they knew the programs existed. A lot of the resident association, Liberty Village was a good one, Fort York, another one, Yorkville, these are, you have access to the leadership of many of those condominiums when you're exposed to or can connect with their residents association. So we would often bring the experts in from the Atmospheric Fund, from the City of Toronto, to say, look at what's available. These resources are here for you. Those are all pretty wealthy neighborhoods who could probably pull it off otherwise, but everyone likes to save money. There were several votes on council that had to do with advancing the Toronto Green Standard, which again builds more efficient buildings when we're building new buildings. And so there was an opportunity to show leadership there. I helped lead some of those votes moving forward. And then eventually, when Transform TO was adopted, we adopted a standard that would have net zero buildings by 2030.
So we have to push for more local councillors to be more active in this department. So beyond trying to rectify policy barriers by selecting and voting for candidates, if financial is the biggest barrier, then realizing the grants and opportunities available becomes that much more important. If policymakers see more demand for retrofitting incentives, they will create more. Where there is interest and demand for something, policy cannot help but follow. This is how we can establish that normative state filled with retrofitting buildings. Taking a closer look at Transform TO, it has a lot of funding opportunities, and this is a great start for retrofits.
The high-rise program, which is a loan that buildings are eligible for, that can then take on initiatives to reduce their energy consumption or switch over to more renewable sources of energy. That would make the entire building more efficient, not just individual condo units. And then there's another program that exists through the Toronto Atmospheric Fund that provides loans for condominiums. So one was a loan from the city that people can then pay back on their taxes, and the other was a loan from a not-for-profit, the Atmospheric Fund, which makes investments. Actually sees these as investments to have financial returns for the fund. It's totally possible to do this. It's can we mobilize the people to do the work, the money to get the work done, and in the case of in the case of larger buildings, ensuring that the people in leadership positions at those buildings understand that the technology exists and the programs already exist to help them realize their goals. Eventually, we're going to have to start telling them they must do it. We switched over from a gas to an induction stove. I have friends of mine saying, "Oh, I would never do that. I like to cook." Yeah, so do I. I'm probably a bigger foodie than all of you, and I was skeptical too. I didn't want to get rid of my gas range. I love my induction stove. It's like by far the thing I use the most in the house of my electric appliances, and it's incredible what it does. So that change is hard.
I mean, there are programs, especially for folks at the lower income scale, where they do provide new high efficiency appliances. Windows are replaced, all kinds of things happen.
The money can be found, and this can be used as a major argument to push for hesitant condo owners and board members that they should invest. With that little upfront cost, the retrofitting buildings become a gift that keeps on giving. They're efficient, saving money in the long term. If there are commercial condo owners, retrofitted or green buildings mean premium rents and occupancy rates, and tenants benefit from lower utility costs that come from energy efficiency. Technical barriers can be breached too. It's up to members of the condo board and owners and tenants themselves to overcome these by gaining and seeking out knowledge.
Every condo is its own world. It has its own leaders, its own needs, its own limitations. So there's really no cookie cutter. The condo across the street did this, so let's do the same thing. So it's very important that every condo understand the limitations within the building and then the owner's needs today and in the future. And with those two pieces, we're able to design a proper EV infrastructure. Think of it like needing a plug in a bathroom for a hairdryer or a plug in a kitchen for a toaster oven. It's not complicated. We need an electrical source, panel, we run some pipe and wire, we put an outlet, we plug in an appliance at the end of the line. EV charging is no different. It's going to a parking spot that doesn't currently have power and saying, how do we get power here? Simple. Some pipe and wire, an electrical panel, and an appliance at the end of the line. The hurdles that condos need to deal with is limited power, distribution of power, and sharing of that power. The average EV driver is not charging more than 1 to 3 hours per night and will never need more than 4 to 8 hours of charge per session. If everyone is coming home at 6 p.m. and everyone doesn't leave till 6 a.m., which is 12 hours of park time, and the average driver is charging 1 to 3 hours, and those who need more are 4 to 6 hours, there's enough time and enough power to fully charge EVs.
Whatever you believe, This is the main thing you should take away. If our provincial and local governments pushed hard enough, change can be made. It's being made. Until then, we do have the power to push for more retrofits and ensure that we don't reach that point of no return. We must retrofit and retrofit fast. Are you ready to make the change?